Okay, would like to welcome everyone to our 400th anniversary of the Mayflower Compact Commemoration. Thank you each for joining us, and we're very excited to celebrate this day together. And I would like to welcome you all and thank you all for coming. And I'm recording this and we'll share it on YouTube so you can share with friends or family later also. We're going to start with a prayer from our friend David Denning, and then we'll have an opening song by our friend Jenna Trapani. She's a beautiful singer, and so very excited to have her join us and share her talents with us. So I'll go ahead and ask David to say the prayer, and let me unmute you. And okay, go ahead, David.
Our Father in heaven, we're so grateful for this wonderful day. We're grateful for this wonderful time of year that we could take an opportunity to show our thanks and gratitude for all those things that Thou hast given us. We're thankful for Denise and this group that we're able to get together and to hear the messages today. And we're grateful for the speakers. We ask Thee to please bless us as we hear these things, that we'll be touched by the Spirit, and that we'll be fulfilled in the information that we're receiving. We say these things in Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, Jenna, are you ready? I'll spotlight you. Okay, go ahead, Jenna.
Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed His grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Oh, beautiful for pilgrim feet, whose stern impassioned stress a thoroughfare for freedom beat across the wilderness. America, America, God mend thine every flaw, conform thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. Oh, beautiful for heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country love, and mercy more than life. America, America, may God thy gold refine, till all success be nobleness, and every gain divine. Oh, beautiful for patriot dream that sees beyond the years, thine alabaster cities gleam, undimmed by human tears. America, America, God shed His grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from shining sea, from sea to shining sea.
Thank you. That was beautiful, Jenna. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, David and Jenna. I just wanted again to welcome you and mention that this was a two-part or a three-part series we're doing to commemorate the Mayflower. In September, we honored them with leaving Plymouth, England, and spoke about their trials and their experiences up until what led them to leave and them leaving. And then now today we're going to commemorate the Mayflower Compact and their voyage. And then in December, when they got off at Plymouth Rock, we would like to commemorate again. And I've titled that one Liberty Rock, a Foundation for Liberty. And we would like to talk some about the principles that the Pilgrims had that allowed them to have success. And they didn't all have success always right at the beginning, but so anyway, I wanted to quickly read a scripture, my favorite scriptures in the Book of Mormon. It's one of, and I wanted to share with that because, so as we know, we're celebrating the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower and the Pilgrims' past voyage. And last Thursday, November 19th, and their calendar is slightly different, was the Julian calendar, so it's 10 days different. It was the 9th for them and the 19th for us, was them finding land here for the first time on the American, spotting the land for the American continent. And then on last Saturday, the 21st, was the anniversary, which was the 11th for them, but the anniversary of the Mayflower Compact. And when they, before they got off the ship, they felt it was important that they made this agreement with each other. And that event was the Mayflower Compact. And that event invoked what I like to call a covenant upon this land. And I would like to read some scriptures from the Book of Mormon that talk about this land, the American continent, being a covenant land. And it's 2 Nephi chapter 1, verses 5 through 10. It states, "But, said he, notwithstanding our afflictions, we have attained a land of promise, a land which is choice above all other lands, a land which the Lord God hath covenanted with me should be a land for the inheritance of my seed. Yea, the Lord hath covenanted this land with me and to my children forever, and also all those who should be led out of other countries by the hand of the Lord. Wherefore I, Lehi, prophesy according to the workings of the Spirit which is in me, that there shall none come into this land, save they shall be brought by the hand of the Lord. Wherefore this land is consecrated unto him who he shall bring. And if it so be that they shall serve him to the commandments which he hath given, it shall be a land of liberty unto them. Wherefore they shall be brought down into captivity. They shall never be brought down into captivity. If so, it shall be because of iniquity. For if iniquity shall abound, cursed shall be the land for their sakes. But unto the righteous it shall be blessed forever. And behold, it is wisdom that this land should be kept as yet from the knowledge of other nations. For behold, many nations would overrun the land, that there would be no place for an inheritance. Wherefore I, Lehi, have obtained a promise, that inasmuch as those whom the Lord shall bring out of the land of Jerusalem shall keep his commandments, they shall prosper upon the face of this land, and they shall be kept from all other nations, that they may possess this land unto themselves. And if it so be that they shall keep his commandments, they shall be blessed upon the face of this land. And there shall be none to molest them, nor to take away the land of inheritance, and they shall dwell safely forever. But behold, when the time cometh that they shall dwindle in unbelief, after they have received so great blessings from the hand of the Lord, having a knowledge of the creation of the earth, and all men knowing the great and marvelous works of the Lord from the creation of the world, having power given them to all things by faith, having all the commandments from the beginning, and having been brought by his infinite goodness to this precious land of promise. Behold, I say, if the day shall come that they will reject the Holy One of Israel, the true Messiah, their Redeemer and their God, behold, the judgments of him that is just shall rest upon them. So I love that scripture. I love how Lehi describes this as a precious land of promise. And you might have noticed that it asked us to keep the commandments in order for us to maintain this as a land of liberty and to maintain that covenant. And I know that the Pilgrims were invoking that covenant when they did this by signing and writing the Mayflower Compact. And with reverence, I would like to remember them and honor them this day with all of you. So thank you for joining us. And I'm going to turn over the time now to Steve and Linda Denning for their presentation. And after that, we'll have Brett and Leanne Perkins. We'll turn over to them for their presentation. So thank you. I have to find, sorry, I have to find Steve. There we go. Okay. Okay, Steve, you can, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, can everybody hear me and can you see the screen?
Are we unmuted?
Can everybody hear?
I can hear you and see your screen. So if anybody else can't, let us know, but I think we're good. Everyone in the chat that says yes.
Okay. All right. Well, my name is Steve Denning and this is Linda Denning, my better half. And we appreciate Denise inviting us to do a little presentation tonight. I appreciate that beautiful song by Jenna that really, I think, sets the tone and the spirit for the things that we're going to talk about. So I appreciate that beautiful song. And of course, David, you gave a great prayer. But since Denise asked us to make this presentation, we probably, like most of you, knew somewhat about Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims and those kinds of things, but it kind of made us do a little extra effort in doing some studying, and we found out some other interesting things that we didn't know. So this was a good learning exercise for us. By no means are we experts on the subject, but I think we've learned a lot. But our presentation tonight is going to be in two basic parts. The first part I'm going to do, and I'm going to talk about the Mayflower Compact and its roots to our democracy in the U.S. Constitution. The second part, Linda is going to talk about some family history stories of her relatives on the Mayflower. On my part, I'm going to do a little short introduction. I'm just going to talk briefly about before the Mayflower because a lot of what happened before was the impetus behind why they wanted to leave England and go to the New World. I'm just going to touch on the journey a little bit, and then I'm going to go into the Mayflower Compact and talk about its significance. And then we'll kind of roll in a little bit to the descendants and kind of hand it off to Linda in part two, where she's going to talk about her, some family members. So I'd like to sort of set the tone or the stage here. I'd like to share a short little clip. It's a short video clip It's called The American Experience, The Pilgrims. It's a PBS official trailer, and you can find this on Amazon Prime if you have that. And you can also actually watch the full-length video in there. And I recommend that you watch that. It's really well done and gives you a good feeling of what the Pilgrims went through and all the significance there is for us today. So I'd just like to share this clip.
From my years young in days of youth, God did make known.
Sorry.
From my years young in days of youth, God did make known to me his truth and called me from our native place for to enjoy the means of grace. In wilderness he did me guide, and in strange lands for me provide.
For some reason you can't see the video, so just listen to it. You'll still get the point.
Through weal and woe, a pilgrim passed I, to and fro.
I think William Bradford knew they were on a journey in this world towards heaven. They didn't know quite how they would get there or where they would finally meet their end, but they were transient citizens of the world. And they were on a journey towards purity. That's what they sought. That's what took them out of England. That's what took them from Holland over to the New World.
At the time, there were a very, very small group of very extreme people. And if we'd never heard of them ever again, nobody would be surprised. The fact that they are, in the long term, extraordinarily successful, that they've found the world's greatest democracy, throws retrospective lustre.
They weren't the people you would automatically expect to be founding a new outpost of the British Empire. These are normal people under extraordinary circumstances, and it ends up being as much a story of survival as it is a story of origins.
If you ask people, where does America start? They'll say, it starts in Plymouth Rock. Despite the fact that Jamestown was founded in 1607 and Plymouth was founded in 1620, it became our story of national origins.
The fascinating thing then about the Pilgrim story is how this tiny group of people managed to get by and managed to tell the story in such a way as to erase that whole other history.
There's been a tremendous amount of memory produced around the Pilgrims. But there's also been a lot of forgetting. That memory is very selective. And part of what we've forgotten is how close suffering and violence were to one another. So to look at what's been remembered and let that shed light on what's been forgotten is an important exercise when we're thinking about something that has been so central to our national imagination.
So I hope that kind of set up. I apologize that the video didn't show, but I think kind of set the tone. So essentially 400 years ago, November 11, 1620, this small ship anchored off the coast of Cape Cod. And they, through a series of events, really unforetold in many ways, living on the edge, they got together and developed this thing called the Mayflower Compact. And it's considered to be the genesis of our American democracy and the US Constitution. They, if we look at the Mayflower, basically it was a merchant ship. It was well past its time, well worn, well-aged, an old ship, basically that would haul supplies and goods. But for this particular time, this particular trip, it carried 132 souls, 30 of the crew members, 102 passengers. And these passengers were in two classifications. They were called saints and strangers. Now, nearly 40 of these passengers were the Protestant separatists, or what we call the saints, and they hoped to establish a new church in the New World. The remaining strangers were composed of merchants, craftsmen, some families that were looking for a new life, some adventurers, and frankly, there were some folks on there that weren't so, they were a little bit shady. Some of them were kind of ex-cons and even seeking to escape England for maybe, for who knows, for maybe some past deeds. So it was kind of a really mixed group. But today, regardless of who they are, we refer to these colonists as the Pilgrims. Now, just to go back a little bit before the Mayflower, there was building up to that time, the Mayflower, for quite a few years, many of the English people who were Protestants were becoming very unhappy with the the Church of England. So these groups began to break off a little bit and began to sort of worship in their own way, apart from the Church of England. And so they got to a point where they decided that maybe they were not allowed to worship as they pleased. If they did not go to church, they were fined. If they did not, if they were caught reading the Bible or doing other types of religious things without the sanctity of the church, they would get into trouble. So at some point, it was kind of enough for these Protestants. And so a group of Protestants called separatists left England and moved to Leiden, Holland. So in Holland, the reason they moved to Holland was because Holland allowed freedom of worship. So there was no problem. They could go there and worship if they pleased. And they had to leave England because they didn't want to be aligned with the Church of England anymore, especially because they felt that the Church of England was nearly as corrupt and idolatrous as the Catholic Church had been. And that was one of the reasons they were given to break off from the Catholic Church. So they felt that the Church of England was at a point where they could not worship freely there. So Holland allowed them to worship. However, even though they were allowed, when they did go to Holland, to worship freely, things were not so good there for them. They could not get good jobs. Holland had a guild system where you had to join a guild in order to get employment. And therefore they could not get good jobs. They got menial jobs, low paying jobs. And then I think the final straw for them after there for a while is that the Holland community and culture was very libertine, very liberal, and they were afraid that their children would be seduced and brought into that kind of lifestyle. So they just felt that at some point this was not the place for them and that they would have to go and decide to move someplace, to go somewhere where they could worship freely their religion. And they decided it was going to be the New World. Now to do that, they first needed to return to London to get organized. They needed funding. They needed someone to fund this trip, which was a lot of money. So as a prominent merchant agreed to advance the money for the journey. And how they did that in those days, and this was very common, what he would do is finance the trip, and they would sign a contract with the Virginia Company. And with this contract, they would settle land near the Hudson River, which was the northern part of Virginia. And this Virginia Company was a trading company. It was chartered by King James I. And his idea was that if he chartered these companies, that they would go and colonize the New World. And so they made a contract, and the idea was that they would go to the New World, they would establish a colony, they would become somewhat prosperous, and then they began to send back bounty back to England, back to the investors who invested in their trip. And that's kind of the way they did it. Jamestown, that was established some 13 years before, was established in exactly the same way, and several other areas in the New World were done this way. So in August 1620, the group of about 40 saints joins a much larger group of mostly secular, or the strangers, and they set sail from England. They went in 2 merchant ships. Again, these ships were kind of old and kind of past their time. It was the Mayflower and the Speedwell. Well, the Speedwell never made it. They got not too far out from sea, and it began to leak, and they had to come back to shore, and the Speedwell no longer could make the trip. So now they had only the Mayflower left, and of all the people that were on the Speedwell and the Mayflower, only a few could get to, were basically there was room on the Mayflower for them to make the trip to the New World. So they, a few of the strangers and a few of the saints gathered together, and they got on the Mayflower to sail again in the direction of Captain Christopher Jones. When they arrived in the New World, they found they were in the wrong place. There's a map here that kind of shows where they were going, but they blew off course. And instead of getting to the original place that their charter had established and that they made a contract with the Virginia company, instead of going there, they ended up ending up in Cape Cod, which was totally located quite a ways from their original destination. So here they were, the Mayflower was there, and technically they had no right to be there. They were not sanctioned by any contract, and they essentially were there in an unauthorized way. Along with that, when they arrived, there were disputes that broke out among the passengers. Some wanted to go back to England. Some wanted to depart and go their own ways. Some were not willing to be part of a religious community. It was chaos, and they were still on the ship. And everybody, I'm sure, was tired and cranky and hungry besides. So they decided that in an effort to bring peace to the group and establish themselves as a colony, and frankly, to survive, they decided that they would come together and write this thing called the Mayflower Compact. Okay, the compact was really unique, and there were some things done prior to this, but there was a turn here that was different, something very unique when they put this compact together. It was the first document that in the New World where there was established of self-government. It was an early attempt at democracy, and it really set the stage for future colonists seeking independence from Britain. And when eventually the Revolutionary War came and the Constitution was written, many of those same principal ideas came from this basic Mayflower Compact. And so it was kind of the beginning of the British subjects with the ability to start having rights of their own and feeling that each man and woman have certain inalienable rights. The compact was clearly and carefully written. It stated one thing for sure, they stated that they were still loyal to King James. They did not want to get on his wrong side and be considered traitors or unauthorized. So they wanted to be sure that King James would approve this compact. It was written, they believe it was written by William Brewster, and Brewster was an educated man, well-written, well-spoken, and of all those on board, he would have been probably the most likely one to have written the compact. It was signed by every adult male on the voyage, both pilgrims and strangers. And again, it established a consensual government, ensuring everyone in the new colony would abide by the same laws. And this was another change, because where they came from, there was a class system, there was royalty, there was nobility, there was those that were various caste systems and levels in the common man. Here, in this new colony, each and every one would be judged by the same laws in the same way, whether you're the richest person in the colony or the poorest. And that was not the case prior to their life in England. Now there was the Magna Carta, which was written more than 400 years before the Mayflower, and it was kind of an attempt to have this idea that those that are ruled have rights. But this was the rule of law. It meant the king's law. It was not the law of the people, whereas the Mayflower Compact established the law by the people and not the king. And that was the big difference, the big turn. Now this document, this Pilgrims document they created, this Mayflower Compact, said that government, that the Pilgrims created a democratic form of government where the officials would be elected and the laws passed, and that had never happened before. Again, every male member signed the contract and they were given the right to vote based on a popular vote. Elder men would have the right to change and propose laws, elect to remove office holders, and this was unprecedented. And again, this was probably what we would call a pure democracy, each person one vote, versus what we have today as a democratic republic, which is different. But this was their first attempt to do this. John Adams later called it America's first constitution. It laid the foundations for two other revolutionary documents, which are the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. And those documents, even they guide our government today as our documents, but they're not just, they don't just affect us as Americans. Our Constitution has inspired other societies, other governments throughout the world who want some kind of a democracy. The principles in our Constitution have inspired their constitutions or their documents as well. So this has been a very powerful thing, and the Mayflower Compact was the one that kind of kicked that off. I'd like to just, the Mayflower Compact words are, it's not much, and it was all one sentence, and I kind of broke it up so that I could break it up on the charts. But here's what it says, and I'd like to read it. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, remember, they wanted to make sure he was happy with it. By the grace of God of England, France, and Ireland, King Defender of the Faith, etc., having undertaken the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these present solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one of another, covenant, and Denise mentioned this, that they believe this was a covenant they made among themselves and with God, and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have hitherto subscribed our names at Cape Cod on the 11th of November, in the reign of our sovereign Lord, King James of England, France and Ireland, the 18th, and of Scotland, and 44th, Anno Domini, 1620. So to sum it up on the Mayflower Compact, it was the first time the colonists, Americans, came together to form their own government. It gives us an idea of the government being by the people and for the people. Does it sound familiar? Signed by all free men on board the Mayflower, each man given equal weight to vote regardless of class or social status. Here are the list of names of those that signed the contract, and maybe some of you are related to some of these names of the people that signed it. The ones that are highlighted here are the ones that Linda's going to talk about in a little bit. These are names that she's related to, and she's going to give a little short history about these folks here that are highlighted. A revolutionary idea. Here's is kind of interesting. While they were committed to Christianity, the Mayflower Compact did not mention a specific church or method of worship, leaving it accepting of both the separatists, pilgrims, and the strangers, many of whom were still members of the Church of England or no church at all. So it kind of rings like our Constitution in many ways, bearing that idea that the Constitution is for all. Religion is not a prerequisite of having these freedoms and rights. And so I think that's kind of an interesting, and that was a revolutionary idea then. I wanted to close this part by saying William Bradford, who was the governor of Plymouth Colony, He said the following, and this, he said, what's the purpose of the Mayflower Compact? And we have to kind of take his word for it because he was there. Having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these present solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves together. There are an estimated 10 million living Americans and about 35 million people around the world who are descended from the original passengers on the Mayflower. You may be one of them. We get to the end of this, it would be interesting to hear if you are, who are out there are related to some of those folks that signed. I'm now going to turn the time over to Linda, who's going to talk about her family history and stories of her relatives on the Mayflower.
Thank you, Denise, for asking me to tell a little about my family history and some of the relatives I have that came on the Mayflower. The three families I'm going to talk about are the Chiltons, the Tilleys, and the Billingtons. I'm going to start with the Chiltons. You can see by the chart how I'm related to them. It goes from James Chilton all the way down to Linda Chapman Denning. James Chilton and his wife were my 11th great grandparents. James was born in 1556 in Canterbury, England. There he worked as a tailor. In all existing documents, his wife is referred to as Mrs. Chilton. Many believe that her name was Susanna Ferner. James and his wife gave birth to 10 children, but these were very trying times, and only 3 daughters lived to adulthood. James and his family were excommunicated from the Church of England because his wife was among 4 people who secretly buried a dead child without having the Church of England perform its mandatory burial rites. Seeking more freedom to worship, the Chilton family left England to join John Robinson's congregation of separatists in Leiden, Holland. The first we hear about the family in Leiden is on July 2nd, 1615, when their oldest daughter, Isabella, married Roger Chandler. It is Isabella and Roger that I came through. Isabella and her husband stayed behind when her father, mother, and the youngest sister, Mary, set sail on the Mayflower. From the information I found, Isabella and Roger came to the colonies later in 1630. The middle sister, Angel, married and stayed in England. The daughter that came on the Mayflower, 13-year-old Mary, is reported to be the first European woman to step ashore at Plymouth, Massachusetts, when a group of women went ashore to do some laundry. James was the oldest passenger on the Mayflower. He died December 8, 1620, while still on board the Mayflower, and it was still anchored at that time in Provincetown Harbor. His wife also died that first winter, leaving young Mary an orphan. It is believed that Mary was taken in by different families. Later, she married John Winslow, the brother of Edward Winslow, and lived to be 72 years old. The next family I want to talk about that I'm related to is the Tilleys. Elizabeth Tilley was also 13 years old when she came on the Mayflower with her mother and father, Joan and John, and her aunt and uncle, Agnes and Edward Tilley. When I learned that my great-grandfather, James Chilton, was the oldest passenger on the Mayflower, I was curious about who was the youngest passenger. I did a little research and found out it was Humility Cooper. She was 1 year old when she journeyed across the Atlantic with her aunt and uncle, Agnes and Edward Tilley. John and Joan, and also Edward and Agnes, all died that first winter, but Elizabeth and little Humility survived. I haven't found who cared for Humility, but I found that she possibly returned to England in her teens. Elizabeth went to live with the Carvers. John Howland also lived with the Carvers. John was one of the miracles on board the Mayflower. During a turbulent storm, he was swept overboard, but somehow he managed to grab a topsail that was trailing in the water. He hung onto it, and miraculously, he was hauled on board safely. Several years ago, Steve and I went to Cape Cod Harbor and took the tour of the replica of the Mayflower and went to Plymouth Plantation. It was a wonderful experience. On board the Mayflower, I was talking to one of the people who portrayed different passengers, and this gentleman told me that his favorite person to portray was John Halland. John served as secretary to John Carver, and some speculated that they even were related. The Carver's children had all died while they were living in Leiden. That first spring in Plymouth, John Carver died, and his wife Catherine died soon after. John Halland became a free man and inherited their estate, and he was also made ward of Elizabeth Tilley. In 1625, Elizabeth and John were married. They had 10 children and 86 grandchildren. They were married for 50 years. John and Elizabeth each lived to be 80 years old. Many of the presidents of the United States came through this lineage. It's very interesting discovering people that you're related to, but sometimes they're not quite the great heroes we hope for. John and Eleanor Billington are my 11th great-grandparents. You can see on the chart my family history from John Billington to me. They came on the Mayflower with their 2 sons, John and Francis. John was about 16 years old and Francis was 14. This family were strangers and not part of the separatists. Many of the articles I've researched say, as an introduction to them, every community seems to have its troublemakers, and the Plymouth colony, it was the Billingtons. The first we hear about young Francis was aboard the Mayflower shortly after arriving in Plymouth Harbor. Many of the men had gone ashore, and Francis, being an active, rambunctious, curious youth, shot off his father's gun inside a cabin, sending sparks towards an open barrel of gunpowder. He almost blew up the Mayflower. Yes, this was my 10th great-grandfather. You can see on the chart that clever stories have been written about the Billingtons. 2 bad pilgrims. Next, we read about Francis after the settlers came ashore. He climbed a tree and claimed to have spotted a great sea in the distance. It was a large pond of fresh water that is still called to this day Billington Sea. The new settlement needed this fresh water to survive. Today, it's a 269-acre warm water pond fed by groundwater. It's popular for recreational purposes. There they swim, go boating, and do a lot of fishing. In May of 1621, young John wandered away from the settlement and got lost in the woods. He was found by the Nauset Indians and later escorted out of Cape Cod. When the search party of 10 men from Plymouth found him, he was decorated with many beads, a gift from his newfound friends. John ended up dying from disease in his early 20s. In 1624, John the father was implicated in a scandal, which was a failed revolt against the authority of the Plymouth Church. But he played ignorant to the plot and was never officially punished. One article I found said more new colonists had arrived in Plymouth. The year was 1630. One was John Newcomen. He was described as a young, impetuous, and he was careless. He thought he could hunt on anyone's property. He had been warned many times about poaching by John Billington and others. When John caught him again on his property, this young man ran and hid in a tree. John shot him in the shoulder, then quickly took him back to the village to get help. This article said that the wound was survivable, but later Newcomen caught a cold and infection developed, then gangrene. After several days, he died. Governor Bradford had John Billington arrested and held for murder. A grand jury heard the case, and John was found guilty. The immediate sentence was hanging. John was the first colonist hanged in the colonies in September of 1630. That same year, Frances married Christian Penn Eaton, the widow of Francis Eaton. They had 9 children and raised their family in Plymouth. I came through their daughter Mary, who was born in 1640, and married Samuel Sabin. They had 6 children. Francis and his wife both died in 1684. Now, some may say it's a coincidence how I found out about my Billington line, but I say it was a wonderful miracle. In 2002, Steve's job had taken us from sunny California to the frozen north of Marquette, Michigan. One cold winter day, Steve finally had a Saturday off, and he wanted to go to the library. Now, the library in Marquette is beautiful. It was built in 1904. I decided to head for the family history section. There wasn't much there. It consisted of 3 shelves. On the top shelf was a book called The Sabin Family of Rehoboth, Massachusetts. I didn't know anyone with the last name of Sabin in my family, but I had a great-grandfather named Sabin Thayer, and I thought, why would somebody name their cute little baby boy Sabin unless it was a family name? I pulled the book down, and it was a treasure trove connecting my family history. Of course, they didn't allow the book to be checked out, but I started copying pages. When I got home, I called my mother in California, who was in her late 80s, to share what I'd found. This was her line and our first family connection to the Pilgrims. I later found out from a member of our church whom I worked with in the Family History Center that years before there had been a Dr. Sabin in Marquette. He was very interested in family history, but when he died, none of his family wanted his books, so they were donated to the library for me to find my family. Next, just for fun, here are some famous descendants of John and Eleanor Billington. We have President James Garfield, who was the 20th President of the United States, and was the 6th great-grandson. James Wellborn Root, who was an architect that worked on the Chicago Exposition, also a 6th great-grandson. Lavinia Warren, who is a dwarf circus performer, who is a 6th great-granddaughter. John Lithrow, who is an actor and the 9th great-grandson. Then Alfred Worden, who was an astronaut on the Apollo 15 and a 9th great-grandson. Then we have the Wilson brothers, better known as the Beach Boys. They're the 10th great-grandsons. And Taylor Swift, who is a singer and songwriter, is 11th great-granddaughter, and me, who is also the 11th great-granddaughter. I'm so thankful for my Mayflower heritage, and I'm glad I had this opportunity to share it with you.
So that kind of concludes our presentation. I just threw a couple of, when we visited the Plymouth, these are not our pictures, but this is kind of what Plymouth looks like today if you go and visit. And this is what it looks like inside their homes. It was kind of rustic, to say the least. And of course, that's Plymouth Rock. When I saw Plymouth Rock originally, I was a little bit disappointed. It was just kind of a little rock. It wasn't this huge rock I thought it was going to be, but that was it. And it even has 1620 on it. How convenient, kind of interesting. And it's encased inside this this memorial right there, and you can see it right there. So I thought that was kind of interesting. This was their crossing. So they went from Plymouth, England to Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts. And so you can kind of see their route. And if you look inside the Mayflower, it's kind of a crosscut of what it looked like inside. About 80 feet long, 24 feet wide. and it could carry 180 tons of cargo when it was in service. These are some of the original signatures of those that signed the Mayflower contract. And we can have a discussion on later if Denise would like to do that, all participants. And if anybody has anyone that has relatives that were on the Mayflower or were Pilgrims, that would be good to share as well. So Denise, I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
All right, thank you. I'll go ahead and turn the spotlight over to Leanne and then Brett Perkins. And that was a wonderful presentation. Steve and Linda, thank you so much for sharing everything with us. I hope you enjoyed preparing because we enjoyed learning from you. And let's go ahead and turn it over to Leanne. Here we go. And I have to make sure you're unmuted, Leanne.
I think I'm good.
Okay, and then
All right. So I just kind of want to go over the conditions on the Mayflower and some of the miracles that happened and God's hand in their journey. So the Mayflower, first of all, describing the ship, it was a big boxy ship. It was not meant for sailing across the ocean. It was just to go from around the coast to deliver cargo in different ports. So as they were traveling across the sea, it was catching a lot of wind because it wasn't very aerodynamic. So it was like really rocking, and when the speedwell sprung a leak, it actually sprung a leak twice. They went out and it sprung a leak, and they went back and got it fixed, and they went out again and it sprung a leak again. So they decided, we're not taking this ship. So some of the passengers crammed onto the Mayflower and some just stayed behind. And so now you have, before it was, I think, 120 passengers split up in both ships. And then now they crammed 102 passengers onto the one Mayflower, plus all the supplies from the Speedwell. So now you have all the supplies that's down in the cargo hold in the very bottom of the ship. And then the passengers, the Pilgrims, they were put on the gun deck, which is like sandwiched in the middle. I don't know if you noticed on his picture of the boat. So the cargo is in the very bottom, and then there's the gun deck, and then above that there were some cabins where the crew stayed. And also in the gun deck they had put their, I don't know what you call a boat, a skiff or something that they use to get to shore once they land. So that was on the gun deck with them, and they had about 58 feet by 24 feet for 102 people. So they were crammed in there on that gun deck, and it was said that they were pretty much treated like cargo themselves, and they were kept down there by the crew because the crew knew they weren't experienced on ships and that they would probably get swept off the ship. So they pretty much told them they had to stay down there for the most part, and a few people would go up and like they shared that one boy was swept off, and luckily that miracle happened where he was holding on, and he I read Bradford's journal. He said even though he was deep under the water for a long time, he still hung on, and they were able to pull him up. And so that was a miracle that he survived that. So you have these people crammed in this small space, 102 people. There were 18 women, I believe, and over a dozen children. I believe there were 3 pregnant women on ship. One of them delivered her child on the ship, on the journey, and his name was Oceanus. That's what she named him. Now the conditions were horrible because they have chamber pots, and this ship is not meant for the ocean, and it is rocking and getting blown back, and this journey took 66 days because they were going back a lot and having to move forward because of the winds. And so it was kind of a miserable journey for these people, but even still, the conditions, the seasick, the being crammed together, living in those conditions, only one person died on that 66-day journey on the ocean. So that was a miracle that they only had one person that died through that journey. Now, of course, once they landed, the death toll went up. Let's see. Also, during their journey, the mast or main beam, they don't, in the journal it's described as a beam. They don't know if it was the mast or just the main beam through the ship, but it broke. And they thought they were in trouble and they weren't going to survive. But luckily, one of the passengers had brought a big screw, and the description in Bradford's journal just described it as a large screw. They don't know if it was a printing press screw or if it was for building steeples or, you know, some sort of an engineering thing for building. But they were able to crank that screw and lift up that beam, and it held it in place so that they were able to finish that journey. So another miracle. They saved the ship and made it there. And as they're traveling and they get to America, they're trying to land in Virginia. That was their plan, was to land in Virginia. But the winds kept pushing them the wrong way, in a different direction. And so they ended up landing in Massachusetts, which was another miracle that we can see, because of all the places they could land along the coast, they landed in the one place where there would be somebody who could speak English, who knew the land, who grew up there, and that could help them. And so Squanto's story, I would like to talk a little bit about Squanto, because I think his life shows us how much God's hand was part of this, because I think it was 10 years before the Pilgrims landed, Squanto had been kidnapped and sold into slavery and was sold over in England, and he ended up being bought by 2 Catholic friars who eventually gave him his freedom, and he was able to work his way back to America. And once he got here, he found out all of his people were dead. They had all got sick, and his whole tribe was gone. So I can't even imagine what that would be like for him, this going through these trials of being sold into slavery, being taken from his people, and coming home and finding every person he ever loved was gone and dead. But God's hand had saved him and preserved him, and he was able to learn English so that he could then come and help the Pilgrims, which I think is pretty miraculous. And Squanto went and tried living with another tribe for a while that was around there, but he just didn't feel like that was his place. And so he ended up traveling back to Plymouth because he wanted to live in the land where he was raised. And so when he went back to Plymouth, then he was able to find and meet these Pilgrims. And he ended up staying and living with them and teaching them how to grow food in this land, because it was very different than over in England where they came from. And so because of him, they were able to survive. And I even read that none of their seed that they had brought grew, it all failed. So they would have starved to death had Squanto not been there to teach them how to live off the land and to grow the food that was there. So I really believe that God saved him and preserved him and brought him on a journey to where he would learn the things that he needed to learn to help these pilgrims. And I also really wanted to compare the pilgrims that came over earlier and established Jamestown. They were made up mostly of men, and they were coming over here for profit and gain. And 90% of them ended up dying. And so just comparing that with the pilgrims who came to Plymouth, a lot of those passengers were coming for religious freedom and to be able to raise their families. They came as families, and they did it with a purpose to worship God and to raise their families the way that they wanted to. And you can just see the difference between those two colonies and how God's hand had blessed and sanctified the Plymouth Rock Pilgrims versus the other group that did not have the success. So I just love that comparison in showing that, God blesses us when we have righteous desires and righteous efforts, and he preserved this land for those righteous people. And so then, once they got here, of course, they had a lot of issues and problems that they had to overcome. But through it all, God was able to bless them, and they were successful. And they actually had a lot of issues starting off with their new compact and people working, and my husband's going to go over that more. And so I will turn the time over to Brett. He can go into that.
Hi, everyone. So I was looking into John Bradford's journal, and annals, excuse me. So it's like history. So it wasn't like at the time he was writing as he goes. He was writing it as his history of what happened, and he shared a few things that were interesting, because it was the agreement that they had to have the community share and all work together, and was actually the agreement that the businessmen, the investors, had made. It was their way of assuring that they got an equal share and got paid back for their investment. So that's apparently how they did it in those days. And so it was kind of like everybody worked to pay back the debt, or pay back the investment. And what they had found is that wasn't working. And these were some of the things that they'd shared on why it wasn't working. For this community, so far as it was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. For the young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine, or did not have the desire that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without any recompense. So repairs and farming and other things. The strong and or men of parts had no more in division of victuals, which is food and clothes, than he had that was weak and not able to do a quarter that the other could. And this was thought injustice. And to have everything shared equally, just to summarize what he's saying next, was thought some indignity and disrespect. And then on the other side, the wives felt similarly in their work, to be commanded to do service for other men, such as making the meals, they say, as dressing their meat, washing their clothes, and they deemed it a kind of slavery. Neither could many husbands deal with that, you know, having their wives go serve another man. And so they essentially thought this was this was lacking the proper mutual respect, that you couldn't preserve that, having basically didn't foster the right kind of work ethic, because everybody was trying to avoid their work, because it wasn't benefiting their family, and their family had to suffer based on the general lack of production or suffering then that was done, and it wasn't, so they resented that, and so it really didn't help things. And so basically by 1623, after about 3 years of these problems and conflicts and what they called laziness, not producing very much, Bradford made an executive decision to do away with that communal requirement. And basically what happened is that they divvied out the land. This was the start of it. They divvied out the land to get everyone a parcel, and then they worked that parcel. And how it went was, initially in the first year, the year of Thanksgiving, when the natives helped, you know, supplement what their plan did not help. They just been able to plant 26 acres, and it didn't go very well. Not only was it not enough acres, but it didn't produce what they were trying to produce in order to survive. But the year later, they planted 60 acres, and then in 1623, once the private property had been established, 184 acres were planted. And Bradford wrote that once this contract with the investors was renegotiated, it was finally paid, and Bradford reflected on this and said of that change, that instead of famine, now God gave them plenty, and the face of things was changed to the rejoicing in the hearts of many, for which they blessed God. So I found that interesting, that that it was, at least in the way I viewed it, was a form of feudalism. So it was, you know, the investors or the lords were getting the bulk of the proceeds, which, you know, they deserve to have that, but that arrangement didn't work with natural law or the nature of men. The nature of men is to be selfish, take care of oneself, take care of one's family, and then also to be able to choose to have charity, and then also to fulfill their obligations that they contracted with these investors, so to pay them back. And so they worked to pay that back just like they would, and they knew that once they paid them back, then they could keep everything else. One thing which was important, that Steve was talking about, with this being kind of the original Constitution that John Adams had talked about. This is kind of like the starting Constitution, the Mayflower Compact, was that this compact had that Charter of Liberties, had that base foundation of liberty of individual property, that was, because in a pure democracy you don't have that. Basically, is the majority, or the even with a king, they can override those principles or those laws and overturn them. So that was the progression, that was establishing that progression, building on liberty, to where eventually we'd have a constitutional republic, and requirements where unanimous, they had to have unanimous agreement for the Constitution, which New York ended up not voting. That's how they got the unanimous of the 13 colonies. They had 12 vote and 1 abstain. And then also the 3/4 and 2/3 requirement. Whereas now we've kind of reverted back to the pure democracy, which is a lead into socialism, which is basically there are no rights if the majority can take it away, or if the lord or king decides that it's that a mandate or a dictate or a executive order can override it because of certain situations or because they want to, they feel like it. So that's an important distinction that we all have to remember on that is that pure, even if we might use the word democracy, it's really a republic. And, we vote for representatives, and that because we are limited by that base constitution, those basic natural laws, that it restrains the legislature or the people, the citizenry, from taking away those basic rights and violating the Constitution. And that was a great blessing. And I just wanted to share that the history and the suffering that they went through and all the founding fathers went through, it's a cycle that keeps going, and we're going to have to go through it again ourselves, unfortunately, to restore what's been lost, because through the corruption of our education and through the corruption of our constitutional safeguards, which one quote that I had found, if I can get my phone here real quick, was aside from having a constitution with basic laws based on natural rights and human nature, there was also like British common law framed this for to ensure that liberty was instilled in the laws. And that was if I can find the quote here, see if I can get it. Find it, but anyway, I'll just paraphrase because it's not here easily for me to pick. But oh, here it is. The history of liberty is primarily the history of process and procedure. And if anybody's ever heard of the Roberts Rules of Order, and that's how they go through meetings to make sure that there's a set way to do things so that people are restrained by order, to make sure that funny business doesn't happen, so that there's a set way they go about it to protect, so that the rules can't be overridden and reduced to chaos, to where manipulation and fraud can happen as easily. And all those safeguards have been slowly repealed, and we've had a lot of people who don't have those same belief in morals, the will of the people, be established. Whereas, if we choose wrongly as a people, then there you go. It just is what it is. But we've got to follow that. And I'm turning the time over to Denise. Thanks for letting me share.
Hi, thank you, Brett and Leanne. Thanks so much for your thoughts. And one thing I just wanted to maybe end on, well, what we're going to do is I'll just end with a closing thought, and then Greg Post will say our closing prayer. But then anyone wants to stay on, hopefully we can all stay on for just a few more minutes. But I wanted to just kind of formally end. but we can do a roll call. Like you can just either in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and show your video if you feel comfortable. And we'd love to just hear what, like maybe where you're from, and if you have an ancestor from the Mayflower. But one thing I wanted, maybe my closing thoughts, going along with what Brett said lastly, is the kind of the will of the people choosing that majority of how things are going. And there's even a scripture that talks about that, that the majority of the people will tend to choose what is right. But when the majority begins to choose wrong, then we won't be led through God's guidance anymore, because he wants us to choose right. And so I wanted to take that thought back to the scripture I read at the beginning. And I don't know if you noticed that it asked us several times to keep the commandments. And God wants us to keep the commandments so that we can remain moral and remain in a state of liberty, because that is ultimately how we maintain our liberty, is really through our personal actions to remain moral. And then as a group, then we will remain as a moral people. So I just wanted to end on that thought. And Greg Post, before you say the prayer, I know you had a couple of thoughts on the Mayflower Compact. You're welcome to share them at this time if you if we want to, right before your prayer, and then we'll open it up, back up to everyone can discuss and share their ancestors. So are you ready, Greg?
I'm ready. Sound check working?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on, I guess, what Steve kind of danced around, and what Brett danced around, is that the story of the Mayflower is largely economics. We have basically a great example of the socialists and the capitalists in competition. When the financiers of the venture contracted with the Pilgrims and others, they had them sign a compact where they would agree to have a common store, and that all would share equally out of that common store. So Marx expressed it later, our friend who wrote the Communist Manifesto, as to each according to his needs and from each according to his ability. That was the basis, or the basic idea behind this pre-Mayflower Compact that was part of the agreement to be financed for the trip. And the result of that agreement was this 3 years of varying degrees of starvation and not doing too well that Brett described, until they finally figured it out that, you know what, every man for himself. You know, it's if your ship is sinking, you're the first guy that's got to bail it out. And so when they figured out, okay, if we assign private property to every party, and they're responsible for what they grow, they're responsible for what's produced, and they're free to trade back and forth in and out among other people, that's when this tremendous burst of economic prosperity, of tremendous crop yields, and the profits that they were seeking to generate to pay back the investors, all came from this great burst of free enterprise. So when our friends in the current day want to dangle the wonders of socialism in front of our eyes and dazzle us with the great promise that that's supposed to bring us, the Mayflower is a great story, a great reminder of, we've tried this before. This isn't the first time at the rodeo. The Russians failed, the Chinese failed and had to go to a mercantilist system. The Cubans failed. The Venezuelans are failing today. Not a good system. Anyway, I thought I'd throw those little tidbits in. You ready for the finale?
Thank you for your,
Okay.
Thanks for that additional thought. I think that, can kind of put it even into a clearer term for today, so we can be, watchful of what's going on. And so I appreciate your thoughts, Greg. And
Wait till you get the bill.
I'm still waiting for last time, so. Go ahead and say our closing prayer, and then we can do our roll call.
All righty. Almighty Father, we give thanks for this time we've been able to spend together reviewing history and lessons that began the great experiment of our country. We give thanks for our modern prosperity and the great blessings that we enjoy still of individual liberty, the many rights that we enjoy. And pray that you will help us to remember them, to foster them, and promote them. We pray for your blessings on us and our country, particularly at this time of great upheaval. We give thanks and ask your blessings in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Greg. Thank you all for coming, and it's been very nice to learn, and hopefully this is educational, and that also we give proper honor to those that come before us. So people, it looks like, have been throwing out some shout outs in the chat, so keep doing that. But I'm going to open it up to this can be a discussion if you have any points you want to add on the Mayflower Compact, but also just feel free to unmute yourself, or I'll start reading in the comments. But we'd love to hear from any of you where you're from and the Mayflower Pilgrims that you come from. So well, actually, Richard, do you want to share?
I'd love to. First of all, let's say thank you to everyone that presented tonight. I really enjoyed hearing all the stories. So to give you context, so I had 6 ancestors in the Mayflower. So some of you are my cousins, both Denise. So I had both Sam and Edward Fuller, John Howland, Stephen Hopkins, John Billington, and John Tilley. So those are all 6 that were that come on my side. So I'm originally so my father was born in Wareham, Massachusetts. I've been to, my parents actually have a house in Sandwich, Mass, which is right up the road from Plymouth. So I have been to Plymouth Plantation, Plymouth Rock, seen the whole thing there. I was born in Danville, Pennsylvania, but I lived up in Boston, went to school in New Hampshire, and I lived all over the country. So I'm on the West Coast now, but my parents have done an excellent job of lineage and family tree, but they've also taught us to be very strong conservatives, patriots, and so obviously this was it was great to connect with Denise and find out about this event tonight. So again, I thank you all for being a part of it, and more importantly for being patriots and holding fast for kind of what's going on in the country right now, and hopefully we right the ship going forward too. So no pun intended. So very good. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to engage with, again, some of you are my cousins, distant cousins. So
yeah,
nice to meet you.
Yeah, it sounds like, thank you for joining as well. Awesome to connect with you, and hopefully we can stay in touch. It sounds like you're cousins many times over with Linda.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So
that's awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you again for joining, for sure. And yeah, let's stay in touch. And hopefully you can maybe join us on the next one too.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay, cool. Would anyone else want to share by video, or I can? Oh, I did want to test Teresa. Teresa, are you ready?
Of course you want to test me.
Okay. Teresa
Well,
is gonna wait. Let me spotlight you. Okay.
oh, thanks.
Teresa is gonna share our ancestors from the Mayflower. Well, I always just say our two direct ancestors. I know we have a lot of like uncles and aunts or cousins, but do you remember the two? So here.
The only name I can ever remember is Edward Dottie.
Okay.
And I was trying to find out from a couple years ago, a teacher had shared with me a story that is like a little children's story that is, I believe, of Edward Dottie's boys, his children.
Oh.
And I was hoping that she would be able to send me back information prior to right this moment, but she hasn't. But if I can find that, I will share it with Denise to share to everybody. But it was just a funny little story that she had shared right before Thanksgiving about 4 or 5 years ago, and I used it with my 6th graders, but I don't know or have a copy of it. And I know you told me, I asked you the other day, and am I correct in saying Fuller?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Yay.
Good. So Fuller is the one that Richard Wentworth, he just spoke. That's the one that we're tied back to from him. And Richard had said he came from Samuel Fuller, that's Edward Fuller's son. And we come from Matthew, that's the brother. So interesting about that is Matthew came across a few years later and Edward died. So we only have Edward Doty that lived on from the Mayflower.
Okay.
So we, but anyway, do you remember what the first thing that Edward Doty took part in? He was one of the first in the colony to do something pretty.
I did not. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll tell.
Okay.
So Edward Doty was the first to participate in a duel, and
I do remember that.
A sword duel. So luckily, he survived. But I think what Linda was saying is not, sometimes you learn some crazy stories, and that's one of the crazy ones.
It's crazy.
But, how about you, Leanne? Do you want to share? Do you want to share for a minute, Luann?
Hi, I had to push a button. Yeah, hi. This was really fun. Thank you, Denise. I learned a lot tonight, too. Well, I'm a descendant, I think, 10th level of Giles Hopkins, who is Stephen Hopkins' son. And I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's my mom's side that traces to Hopkins. And my grandmother had always told us that a man named Stephen Hopkins had come on the Mayflower, and that was her relative. And we were all like, yeah, grandma, whatever, right? We never believed her that it would be that. And a few years ago, my sister decided to trace the genealogy and then and found it going to the Mayflower. I said, well, grandma knew what she was talking about after all.
That's awesome.
So yeah, it's pretty fun. Now I have a question for anyone who might have an answer. In the bit of reading that I had done on Hopkins, there was a story of him brokering a peace deal with the natives. Had anyone else come across that information? And I was thinking, if yes, then that would help me get a trail or start a path and do some research in that area.
I haven't read that yet, but there's a book called Here Shall I Die Asunder. Have you got that book?
No.
It might talk about it in there. It's specifically about Stephen Hopkins and his journey, because he was the only person on the Mayflower that had come previously to the American continent, and he went to Jamestown, and he was shipwrecked in Bermuda, and so his whole life story is very interesting, but there's a newer book called Here Shall I Die Asunder, and it's by Caleb. I think his last name's Caleb, but
okay,
that's a great book to look that up, and that can be some homework for me and whoever else wants to research, and maybe in December, because I'm kind of hoping in December we can now talk a little bit more about now they've gotten here and some more of those stories, and that sounds like a good one we could follow up with. Because that's important, is that's the next step, is they're here now among the natives and what happened, and so that sounds like an interesting story for us all to find out.
Yeah, especially since the day after the Friday, which I guess was yesterday, was I think Native American Day, and and I've heard people discuss that celebrating Mayflower and whatnot is a disgrace to the Native Americans because it was just to come and annihilate them.
Yeah.
We don't really know that story, do we? So I think that would be, it's almost as like we need our a little ammunition to say, well, actually, it didn't really go that way, you know, and I'm a proud descendant of the Mayflower.
Yeah.
Leanne, if I could jump in, there is a book called Mayflower. It's called Mayflower, and it's written by Nathaniel Philbrick, and it's one of the best books I've read. It's basically it's the voyage of the Mayflower, the settlement of the colony, the electrifying history of the Pilgrims, the story of it's a 55-year epic. It basically covers that period, and it talks about the conflict, the bloody conflicts. And so on, and so I bet you he might be in there as maybe negotiating with the Indians. It's for the Native Americans. So it's called Mayflower.
According to Wikipedia, it says that the first formal meeting with the natives was actually held at Hopkins's house.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Well, you know, Northern California, we can reenact that here.
Yeah, there we go.
Well, and I did read that the Pilgrims had a very good relationship with the Indians, and they helped each other a lot, and they were, for over 100 years, they had peace with them. But it was some of the other men that came that weren't part of the religious groups that had conflict with the Indians. So.
Also the group of Native Americans that they had peace with were basically the enemies of the other tribes, and they basically banded together for their own safety and defense. So Massasoit and his nation basically teamed up with the Pilgrims because the other Indian tribes were persecuting them. So there was kind of a mutual defense, as you said, for almost 100 years, where they were mutually defending one another.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm going to add too. I think it was the Pilgrims that had the weapons, and not the natives. So that would have made them much stronger being with the Pilgrims than even having other tribes with them.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard. Well, recently I heard that the Wampanoag even moved closer to the Pilgrims, probably for a similar reason, kind of almost connecting with the Pilgrims versus some of the other tribes. And so I also heard with, and this is what I would love to discuss more, like next time, or even, you know, a little bit more, even a fourth time, but because this is really important. And I think like what Luann brought up, there is that like push right now for, oh, we can't be proud of it, and it was only for this. But as Leanne talked about, they were coming here with, there were miracles that we could see, and even with Squanto is one of them in that relation. And I do remember Stephen Hopkins was very influential in that, because Squanto lived at Stephen Hopkins' house. So I do know that, Luann. But they came here and they wrote in the Mayflower Compact into the furtherance of Christianity, and they started it within the name of God, or so they were doing this for their real push for it, or desire was to seek the religious freedom. And that was, even though they came with strangers, the strangers didn't just come. The strangers that came were, as Leanne pointed out earlier, they came in the Jamestown settlement. And it didn't work as well where the Pilgrims came in the name of the Lord. They came with that desire to further Christianity, to have this religious freedom. And so I believe that that's why they succeeded more. But I also I've been studying, I really want to learn more about this, Luann, because when, I have my own beliefs and knowledge, but sometimes I think when we have facts, we're not all working necessarily on the same facts. And so, well, first of all, a fact is truth. So that's the first thing, is a fact is truth, right? So when people know facts, we tend to then develop a similar idea or reasoning about it, and we come to the same knowledge and truth. We all fall upon the same truth, I guess. I don't know how else to word that, but right now we're being told certain things, and we want to be, there is a force that wants us to hate our founding. So the Mayflower is what we think of as really the beginning of our American founding. And, that's what I wanted to discuss and share with tonight, is that, and that started within the Mayflower Compact, and it was a covenant with God. And it wasn't necessarily perfect at first, as we talked about. They, for 3 years, tried socialism, that didn't work, so I tweaked it. But it's still, their reason for coming here was just, and they it was like a good reason. And so I don't believe that we have to hate our founding. And there's a reason that they want us to hate our founding, because then we hate then we don't have a foundation for why is the Constitution important. We lose that foundation if they can get us to not be, and it's not that we have to be proud of it, but that I want this more as a reverence, and a remembrance that they sacrificed for us, and it began to set the seeds of liberty. And so that's why next time when they did get off at Plymouth Rock, because they lived on the ship a whole other month, they got off at Plymouth Rock, and I'm like, oh, rock, what do we build on as foundation? So Plymouth Rock is a foundation for liberty, and I think that's what it is. It doesn't, and I like how Leanne pointed out too, like they did have peace treaties, and when they used land, they, with full intent, repaid the Native American tribes. They repaid them because that was part of their morality, is not to steal. So even though they might have used it in the beginning, there was no one around to ask, so they used what they found, and then with full intention, they did repay. And then they set peace treaties. And so Stephen Hawkins is a very interesting person to study, and I want to learn more about him for sure. But they lived under those peace treaties for like 150 to 100 years. And it wasn't until, I have actually a really good video I could send you, Luann. It's called It's called The City of Allen. That's the name of, I'll text it to you, and I can text it to others, but anyway, just if you want to look it up. It's called The City of Allen, and the Mayflower 400th. But The City of Allen is the YouTube channel, And they,
Okay.
yeah, so what I learned from them is that there was a second generation. Those peace treaties worked really well, but it wasn't until the second generation that they began to falter. And then you look at now, like little by little, they're eating away and trying to break down each generation so that we forget the peace treaties or the Constitution, the way it's supposed to work. We're forgetting our foundation little by little as a generation passes. And so you saw that even right in the beginning. So they had these peace treaties, and again, they didn't come here to plunder and to, steal and all that. They came to find their religious freedom. And so that's why I believe they were blessed. So I think it's an interesting subject, and I definitely want to learn more, because I also don't want to ignore the Native American side, because, and that's for me personally why the Book of Mormon ties in very well, because I believe that the Book of Mormon is a record of the ancient inhabitants of America, which would be the Native Americans, their ancestry. And so that for me kind of fits a puzzle piece in it, but that this was at times, even for their ancestry, a covenant land. It's a very special land, and that's why I love it. That's why I wanted to do this, to just pay honor to, not only the Pilgrims, but the Wampanoag and all the tribes and the Native Americans, and this land just as it is, for a land of liberty. And it's been a land of liberty for not even past the Pilgrims, and that record comes in the Book of Mormon, and that's my belief. And it's a special land, and where we can, hopefully continue to learn from our mistakes and get there, but keep our freedom. And that largely comes again through living a moral life. So sorry we got a little sidetracked, but I just thank you for your. I love that.
That was great.
Yeah, Leanne.
Can I just add another story I heard was that the Pilgrims actually hung one of their own people based off the word of 2 Native Americans, that he had done something, and so they treated those Native Americans like equals. I mean, what other people, like conquering people, don't come and treat them as equals? And like you said, they didn't come to conquer and plunder. They came to build a life for their families and their children and their children's children. And they wanted to get along with the Native Americans. They wanted to build a life with them. So it wasn't about plundering. They held the law, and they held it equal for everyone, including the Native Americans.
Awesome. Thank you for adding that, Leanne.
Mm-hmm. Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Something? Okay. My video has been spotlighted. Oh, okay. Hi. I was looking at one time about the people who had survived the first winter, or who were at the first Thanksgiving, and noticing how many of the women had died. And so I was telling my husband about that, and I said, you know why the women would have died, but not the men or the children? It's because a woman will do anything at all to save her child. And I'm going to guess that the women forwent their food in order to make sure that the men, they knew they had to work, so they needed to be fed in order to be strong enough to work, and the children needed to be fed in order to be able to grow and carry on the genes. And to me, that's why more of the women would have died. And it really came to light with friends that I have that chose not to be with their children this Thanksgiving because they're so concerned on coronavirus. And I thought, wow, it is so hard to get between a mom and her child. They've really done a good job at scaring people to keep moms from allowing their children at their dinner table with the holidays. And I know that sounds like a downer and whatnot, but it is a connection of what I've learned, the little bit that I've learned about the Mayflower and my heritage, and how important it is, like Denise is saying, how important it is to recognize that now, because the virtues that they came with and the beliefs that they came with and the way that they lived their life is under attack right now in all the ways that we live our life. And we've got to hang on to what the Mayflower brought here, the passengers that came here, because that is the life that we still want to live, right? So.
Yeah. Yep. And thank you. Thanks for sharing that, because that's like a very sobering thought. And I never thought about that. I actually didn't, but I heard recently, I like how you pointed it out though, and I agree with it because it makes sense. And then I did recently hear
Thanks, Teresa.
that some of the women, so they had to live on the ship for a while before they found a good place to actually get off and all of that. Why Stephen Hopkins was the scouter, he would go out in the shallot a lot because he was the only one that had been to the continent before, and he was kind of an explorer. But I did hear recently, and I don't know any specifics, but that the women would huddle over their children to keep them warm, because they got here in winter. Like they got here, like we're celebrating it this week, think of our temperatures now, even in California, it's like freezing, So we just think of that. They got here in winter and had to stay for a long part throughout the winter before they even got off the ship. And I do remember hearing that they huddled over their children to keep their children warm. And
yeah, that's true. Most of the women actually froze.
Yeah,
because they were covering their children from the cold, and that's how most of them died, was from freezing.
Yeah, so I bet that coupled with the food, the pointing out with the food, I am sure. Yeah, so I'm going to read a couple of the chat so I can read off who people's ancestors are. But if you want to, before you go, just chime in if you wanted to share your, if you wanted to do it. So Richard Wentworth, he already did share, but he said John Howland. Oh, I did want to point out real quick. This being John Howland was special in that Linda and Leanne both mentioned him falling off the ship and miraculously being able to hold on and to one of the ties and then pulling him back in. So John Howland, and I hope I'm getting this right. Yeah, but he was a direct grandfather, I don't know how many generations back, but he's a direct ancestor of Joseph Smith. And so then I think of Joseph Smith, and we also, this year is a Jubilee year, and it's the 400th year of the Mayflower and the 200th year of Joseph Smith's first vision. Well, Joseph Smith, him coming forth for restoration of the gospel, and again, that's my belief, but that he was special and set apart for that. So his ancestor, almost died on the Mayflower, and so that alone is also a miracle when you tie it to Joseph Smith and everything that he did. And so anyway, back with Richard, he was Sam Fuller and Edward Fuller, who was my common ancestor with him, John Billington, John Tilley, Stephen Hopkins, and then Anita Norton said, I am a Bradford and Pittsford. She's from Pittsfield, Massachusetts. So thank you for joining us, Anita. Anita, would you like to share anything? You're still here. If you want to, you can unmute yourself and share. But she says she's a descendant of William Bradford. And thank you, Anita, for sharing. And also, I'll keep reading, but if you want to, you can drop your email in the chat, and then I can email you directly a recording of this. And it will be up on my YouTube. Denise Franson is my channel. So then Martin Gunnell says, thank you for the informative stories. My wife and I live in Syracuse, Utah. My wife's ancestor is William Brewster, and I have Hopkins, Soul, Howland, Tilly, Chilton, and probably everyone else that survived. Lou Ann, who we just heard from, was Stephen Hopkins. Anita Norton, she says, awesome presentation. Thank you, Anita. Jody Sumbo is from Southern California. Her 10th great grandfather is John Howland. Lou Ann says, this was great, thank you. And Jody says, hi Dennings, good to see you. And let's see, Jody also says, thank you for your time and preparation on this presentation, very informative. Brian Croft, that's my father-in-law. He says, thank you to all who spent time and effort to prepare and share. And Greg Post says, yay, Denise, thank you again for the 400th commemoration. And Corinne said, nice to meet you, cousin. I think she was talking to Richard Wentworth when he was talking. And then Jenna shared, not about the Mayflower, but I wrote a patriotic song and I would love to share it with you all. I'm not looking for subscribers or fishing for likes. I just wanted to get this song out as many people as possible who love this country. Please feel free to share with your patriotic friends. Here's the link. So if you want, I can play that at the very end. You know, like everybody could leave if you need to, but I could play that at the very end. It's a really awesome song. Martin Gunnell also is Edward Doughty. And Jim says, this was most interesting and educational. Thank you for inviting me. Enjoy this with everyone. So let's see. And Teresa said, thank you for that perspective, Luann, on the women. And let's see, Jim says, oh, Elena Loa, and I have your Facebook. So I live in Eugene, Oregon. The idea that this is a promised land is absolutely true. The Constitution was an inspired document written by Thomas Jefferson, one of the most intelligent individuals that ever lived on the earth. And then we have our emails, so I'll go ahead and keep those and send this out to all of you guys so you can share with those others, and we'll keep in touch, and we can do this again next month too. One more, Sherry Lee says, I live in upstate New York. I am a direct descendant of John and Elizabeth Tilley and Richard Warren. Thank you, Sherry Lee. Thanks for coming and thanks for sharing that. So just a quick question. The 19th is let's see, that's the day they got off on Plymouth Rock. And it's a Saturday again, and it's right before Christmas. It's the Saturday before Christmas, and Christmas is on the Friday. So, you know, we still are spreading it out a week, but is anybody have an opinion if that would be an okay day to still do this, or would that be too busy of a time? So, are Leanne, you and Brett okay with that day? Okay, so we'll keep it that day, because I think it would be kind of neat to, like, I've tried to get the other ones to work on the day of like the event, but it's for preparation, you know, it was harder. So I think it would be neat if we could keep it on that day, because it would be the kind of the actual day. And so we'll go ahead and keep that in the 19th. So remember that day, and I got everybody's email coming through the chat. So I'll email you reminders, and then we can start now and kind of invite even more people and have other participants. And so thank you, Leanne and Brett and Linda and Steve for participating, and everyone for joining us. And thanks a lot. I hope you all enjoyed it. Hi. Hi, Kayla. How are you?
Good.
Good. How are you, Kaylin?
Good.
What are you up to?
Nothing.
Did you have a fun Thanksgiving?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you, Brett.
I do have a funny story if you want to hear it.
Yes. Do you want it recorded?
Sure.
Okay. It's still recording.
Brett descends from John Alden and Priscilla Mullen. And there was this funny love triangle, they called it, it was called Plymouth's First Love Triangle. Anyway, so there was a man called Miles Standish on board, and he was very shy, and he had a little thing for Priscilla Mullen, but he was too shy to tell her. And so he had John Alden go tell her that he liked her. So John Alden went to tell her, and when John went and told her, Priscilla said to him, "Speak for yourself, John Alden." So I think she had a thing for him, and she's like, tell me how you feel about me. Anyway, so they ended up getting married, but it was just a fun little story.
That's cute. That's fun. I think there's a really great video. It's more of a drama video, but of the Mayflower. And I don't remember the name, but anyway, I think it portrays that story, because I kind of remember some other scene in there. So, well, thank you all.
There's a park in California, Northern California, called Standish Hickley. Well, it's Standish Hickley.
Oh, nice. It probably comes.
So maybe he got his way all the way over to California. That'd be pretty amazing, really, in that time period.
Yeah. Yep. It's awesome to think about how many people are around and that are descendants and have been affected. So, yeah.
I think it's 1% of the U.S. population are descendants.
Really? Oh, cool. That's awesome.
Gives you the size.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and thank you all for coming, and you can stay on a little bit.